Alright, so basically, imagine like a moment from the 13th century. Alright, we've got Martin of Tours, famous guy. He's riding alone on his horse, and it's like, it's a cold and it's a dark night, and it's in the medieval times, so he's gonna approach this like walled city, and outside the city gates, he's gonna come across a beggar, and this beggar, he's starving and he's struggling and he's just fucking miserable, right? So, famously, out of selflessness and compassion, Martin of Tours, he cuts his cloak in half and he gives half of his dinner to this, desperate guy outside the city. And so, this example serves as kind of like one of the profound acts which has guided at least the Christian kind of definition of charity. And, it shows that you have a certain moral and ethical responsibility to like care for others. But, playwright Bertolt Brecht, he had an interesting take on this story. And so he challenged the idea where, okay, one beggar, right? One beggar, which Martin of Tours cares for. It's pretty obvious what to do. There's one beggar, you take care of him. But what if instead of one single, cold and starving beggar, what if there were 50? What if there were 60? What if there were 100? Or what if there were millions, right? What does an ethical person do if instead of having one person to care for, you have hundreds, potentially hundreds, maybe more? The right choice becomes a little bit less clear. And, basically just the question is, what do you do? And so, if you take this idea, you can extend this kind of line of questioning into an investigation into the healthcare system of the United States. And so it's like, how does a society like the U.S. equitably address the immense and varied needs of an entire population, right? So, how do, within the constraints of the American healthcare system, which is fragmented and complex and just kind of entirely fucked, how do you care for all these people? What is, the ethical obligation of the government to care for all of its people? Keeping in mind that a healthcare system has to be both fair, but also, sustainable. So, much like the decision that Martin of Tours made back in, the medieval times, we're going to question some of the, similar moral imperatives of a modern healthcare system. And so, basically the central question, the critical question, is whether or not healthcare should be considered a right or a privilege. And, this question is important, right? And it's, should it be a right or a privilege? And whichever way you decide to view it as, how can we as a society provide healthcare that is equitable, accessible, organized, but also, realistic and economically feasible. It goes beyond the simple question of a right or a privilege. It kind of goes to, how the fuck do we actually do it? So, basically, in order to figure out how we have to do it, we do have to start with the question of whether it's a right or not. Even though it's not the only part, it is crucial and it is kind of the guiding question. Right, so is healthcare a fundamental right? Let's start with that. So, the moral claim for healthcare as a right, it arises out of, people who want to be just, or people who want to be equal, and, gotta be fair, and these ideas of justice, equality, and fairness have been, basically woven into all discussion of the rights of, human discourse, and, naturally, as they should be. And some examples of this in the real world are like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is abbreviated as UDHR, and this was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, I think in 1948. I might be wrong, but either way, Article 25 says, quotes, says, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. So this kind of idea is one of the core kind of foundational parts of the framework for healthcare. Healthcare not as a luxury or a privilege, but as a core component, which is part of what it means to have a decent standard of living. And so some philosophical foundations to this question. One of the leading philosophers who is famous for his discussions about what it means to be a person and what kind of rights a person would have would be John Rawls. And so his work, A Theory of Justice, which I think was made in 1971, he offers, he got some compelling rationale for healthcare as a human right. Rawls generally in his work doesn't often talk about healthcare directly, but his thinking can be, very much applied to healthcare because it's a question of, human rights. And so basically, one of the main things in A Theory of Justice is his theory, which is called the difference principle. And the difference principle is, it basically says that societal inequities are only justified if they result in benefits for the least advantaged. Right? And so healthcare has the potential to fit pretty neatly into this framework as a fundamental public good. And so if you're going based on Rawlsian thinking, ensuring equitable access to healthcare is not simply charity or, benevolence or just, trying to make yourself feel better, but it actually is an act of justice. It's necessary in order for to withhold the standards and the principles of human dignity. And so, if we go off of his ideas of what justice and fairness demand, they demand that a just society would provide universal health care to everybody. So, completely disregarding economic status or any other elements, everybody, no matter what, has a right to universal health care, has a right to a system that has a right to be provided health care, hopefully for free. It never actually specified for free, but it basically, in order to fulfill his requirements, it would have to be free. And so basically, just more practically, Rawls is arguing for a system in which the government plays a very crucial and central role in ensuring the fair distribution of the resources of healthcare. And so he sees healthcare as a necessary public service. And healthcare ensures all the different individuals' abilities to live and their ability to have a meaningful life, which is one of his key conditions for achieving an overall just society, right? And so healthcare is not just a tool. It's not a commodity that can be traded. It's actually it's a vehicle for equality. It's necessary for fairness, and withholding the well-being of all members of society, no matter what. So that is kind of the Rawlsian approach. Another philosophical perspective could be of utilitarianism, and one of the utilitarian philosophers who I find, could be very applicable to healthcare is specifically John Stuart Mill. And so, his theory of utilitarianism, it's different from Rawls, but it's also it's also applicable to healthcare. And so in his work, Utilitarianism, from the 19th century, I believe it was 1863, Mill's going to argue that the ethical action is the one that maximizes the happiness for the greatest number of people, right? So whatever makes the most amount of people happy must be the correct moral and ethical choice. And if we extend this thinking to healthcare, we'll get that a healthcare system is crucial for the well-being of an enormous amount of individuals. According to him and his kind of thinking, by extension, a privatized healthcare system where you have to pay and it's not universally available, it greatly benefits the few who can pay for it, but there is an extraordinary amount of people who will be overall unhappy. And so having that kind of system ends up being unethical, whereas a universal system where everybody has access actually must be ethical, because it provides people with the most amount of overall happiness. And so, similar to Rawls, Mill's logical conclusion is that health is not a luxury. It's not a commodity. Kind of like, as I said earlier, it's essential for maximizing social utility and making everybody overall as happy as possible. So, because of this, universal access to healthcare is like a moral duty of the government, and because it benefits society as a whole, and it is necessary for us as a society to create conditions where people have the ability to thrive and engage with their life without the debilitating effects of poor health and the inability to receive care because you happen to be poor or discriminated against in some other reason. And so, if we were to apply these specifically to the United States, we would have to have a drastic shift in how the United States healthcare system is formulated. So currently, the U.S. system, it's like a whole big ass combination of private insurance. You've got public programs, kind of like Medicare and Medicaid, and you've got, but that's like semi-public. It's got some private elements, and you've got the VA system, which is essentially fully private. Fully public. That's the veteran systems, and so these programs and these different avenues of getting healthcare, they do provide healthcare to groups. Millions of Americans are given healthcare, but not as many who are covered, but there are still Americans who have no coverage, or even if they have coverage, it's inadequate. They don't have access to any standard of adequate care, and this is an issue. It causes significant disparities in health outcomes. The groups that are, you could guess this, but the groups that are affected are low-income people, minorities, and people who live in rural populations because they don't have, as ready access to healthcare services. And so, basically, summed up, the arguments for healthcare as a human right, it's basically that it must be universal because everybody has the right to healthcare. It is fundamental to who we are. And it's not a commodity, it's not a privilege, it cannot be, it cannot be charged because it is something that is crucial to what it means to be a human being. And as a society, we must recognize that health and being in good health, all members having availability and the option to be in good health is necessary for a just society. And if we don't do that, we are morally implicated. We have a moral deficiency. And so their argument would be that the U.S. system currently is at a bit behind in the moral aspect because it's not fully universal. So basically, it is our responsibility, or more specifically the government, but it is the responsibility of society to create a system that serves the common good and only the common good, and not benefiting, there's no ability to benefit from it. And it would ensure that all Americans have access to, healthcare system because what it means to be human, part of that is having healthcare. So that's healthcare as a right. Now, in order to fully understand the debate, you have to also look at the other side of the question, and that is healthcare as a privilege. And the best argument that I think anybody makes for healthcare purely as a privilege is the philosopher Leonard Peikoff. And he gave a speech, and it is fittingly titled "Healthcare is Not a Right." I wonder what he's going to talk about. But anyway, so he basically, Peikoff gives a structured philosophical argument against the idea of healthcare being a right. He's specific in his critique of healthcare as a right. It can't happen. Healthcare must be a privilege, essentially. And so, if we look at his argument, specifically the argument that he made in his speech, which, he gave it in the 80s, it was specifically, 90s, 93, I think. He was speaking about the Clinton healthcare program, but he was speaking to healthcare in general, but this was specifically at the time when Clinton was proposing some stuff. So basically, his argument centers around some critical concepts. He's going to talk about the nature of rights, the moral implications of claiming rights to goods and services, the function and the role of government in healthcare, and just the real-world practical realities of how to access and deliver a strong healthcare system to the maximum amount of people possible. And so basically, he starts off his argument with a clear and kind of categorical explanation of what a right actually is. What a fundamental right actually means. And so Peikoff identifies, true human rights specifically as negative rights. And so this is, in order to understand this, you have to know what positive and negative rights are. And so a negative right is basically the right to be left alone, kind of. You can think it that way. It's like, you can't take this from me, you can't prevent me from doing something, you can't hinder me from doing what I want. They're like the constitutional rights. I'll get to that in a second. But positive rights are rights where it's like, it must be given to you, it must be provided to you. Like, that would kind of be what would be going on in the healthcare is a right, argument. Healthcare is a positive right, it's something you are required to be given. But Peikoff identifies true rights are exclusively negative rights. So, kind of as I said, a negative right is the freedom to act without any outside interference, and it's to, the freedom to act upon one's own judgment and to pursue the kind of life that one wants to pursue and to keep the products of your own labor. So basically, this guy is the anti-Marxist. He is everything is a privilege. You work for everything. You keep what you work for, and nobody can tell you otherwise. And so, because of this type of argument, negative rights, inherent, by definition, do not demand the actions of others, and something that does demand the actions of others is violating their individual rights, and so that would make it unethical. And so, so negative rights, they only demand that others do nothing to hamper an individual's personal pursuit of their happiness or freedom. And this is kind of what I was saying earlier. Look at the Constitution. Endowed by your Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Constitutionally, you're not being given the rights. You're not given the right to demand something. You're given the right to be free of outward constraints on your personal chase of freedom. And so Peikoff says that these are the only valid rights, negative rights, and that these rights are, kind of enshrined in the human freedoms of, freedom of speech, right to property, right to life, that kind of stuff. Your right to do whatever the fuck you want, and nobody can stand in your way. So, he's going to specifically highlight that a right must not cast a burden on others to perform an action for the benefit of you. So you cannot demand that somebody else does something which burdens them and benefits you. So in essence, it's the right to be left alone. The right to have nobody bother you is the only true right that you have. And there are multiple ways that can happen, but that is basically his exclusive idea of a right. And so if we were going to apply this thinking specifically to healthcare, you can see the problem. It becomes extraordinarily apparent that healthcare, unlike a right, a right where to be left alone, the right to be, the right to be to be free to do what you want, and you don't have the ability to demand other things. Healthcare requires the active participation of others, the doctors and the healthcare professionals, and they're compelled and they are forced to provide their services to you. In his speech, he says, this is a quote. He says, "Under the American system, you have a right to healthcare if you can pay for it, i.e., if you can earn it by your own action and effort. But nobody has the right to the services of any professional, individual, or group simply because he wants them and desperately needs them. The very fact that he needs these services so desperately is the proof that he had better respect the freedom, the integrity, and the rights of the people who provide them. You have a right to work, not to rob others of the fruits of their work, not to turn others into sacrificial, rightless animals, laboring to fulfill your needs." So that, in essence, is Pycroft's entire argument. And so, paying attention to that, healthcare is in direct opposition of, I'm going to call it Pycroftian, but I don't know, that's not like an official term, of the Pycroft's idea of negative rights. It's because it requires an imposition of burden on healthcare professionals in order to satisfy the needs of, those who actually need the care. And so from this, Pycroft is going to kind of build his entire case to show that the very idea of universal healthcare is violating the rights of every healthcare professional, and so in turn, free universal healthcare is entirely unethical. And so, because it's coercive, where rights must be non-coercive, and healthcare is inherently coercive because you are demanding the services from the healthcare professionals. So, the moral issue of healthcare as a right, again, is rooted in the coercive nature of imposing the right upon others. And so free healthcare would demand that individuals, particularly the healthcare professionals, are forced to provide a health service to you, and that demanding the health service for free, as opposed to paying for it, is demanding others to work for you. And if you are kind of understanding where I'm going, demanding others to work for you for free is slavery. And so Pycroft concludes that free healthcare is essentially a hidden form of slavery. And while that conclusion's a little wild, you can follow the arguments up to that point about violating the rights of doctors and what a human right actually is. And so the role of government and how it should be, what position it should have in providing healthcare. And so basically his critique of healthcare as a right extends to the government in ensuring that healthcare is a right. So if healthcare is a right, then it has to be provided by the government through a necessary and compulsory redistribution of wealth. And so this takes away the property from the individuals. So before, you had taking away the freedom of the doctors, and now, because of the government having healthcare be free, it would be taking away the wealth, which is the property of individuals. So free healthcare denies the freedom and the property of the individuals who are, providing you services at their expense. He says, "You are entitled to something," the politicians say, "simply because it exists and you want or need it, period. You are entitled to be given it by the government. Where does the government get it from? What does the government have to do to private citizens, to their individual rights, to their real rights, in order to carry out the promise of showering free services on the people?" This is the question, right? And so the answer to this question, as you probably know, is extremely high taxes on all of the American citizens. And, Pycroft kind of relates the idea of healthcare to the greater, moral issue of government wealth distribution. But in order for the government to declare a right, it has to get the funds, and it's going to put a high tax on all Americans in order to pay for this new healthcare system. And now you may be saying, "Oh well, don't the rich, when they get the large burden of these taxes. Don't they already pay for the majority of the taxes? But if you were going to look at how much the system would cost, taxing the rich, even though they are not taxed more comparatively, but even though their actual dollar amount of being taxed is more, it has no ability to cover the entire system. If in Medicare exclusively cost $839 billion last year. And so, yeah, taxing the rich is not going to cut it. It's going to have to tax everybody. It's going to have to highly tax everybody. And so the people who are really getting fucked over by this system are middle class people, because the richest of the rich are going to be able to afford it. They'll be pissed, but they'll be able to afford it. In order for free healthcare to actually be funded, the entire middle and lower class is going to be absolutely boned because of how much they're going to have to pay in order to cover the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars which the healthcare system would have to, cost in order for it to be free for everybody. And so like a fully universal healthcare system, which must maintain a high standard of care, it's just not feasible. It literally can't happen. And so he concludes from the idea of rights and how economically feasible it is. He concludes that healthcare is something that must be earned. It is a commodity. It is something that can be bought. It is not a right to which all are entitled. Doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers, they have freely chosen their profession, and they enter into it, as somebody who owns their profession. They own their work. This is necessary for there to be, voluntary exchange and for the healthcare market to function. And so by violating this, by making healthcare entirely free, you're essentially denying the personal freedoms of doctors. You're denying the right to property for all those who have to pay for it, and it's not economically feasible. So there are three things that are completely shitting all over the idea of healthcare as a universal human right. And so what are we going to do now? Because if we have healthcare as a human right, according to Pycroft, it is inherently unethical because of what it demands from healthcare professionals. But also, if you look at the idea for healthcare, for the argument of healthcare as a right and not as a commodity, we see that a standard of health is required in order to fulfill the obligations to the members of society and to keep their health high, to keep their overall well-being high, to keep overall happiness high. So basically, we're kind of at the point now where, what do we do? Like, how do we move on from this? And so, basically, we have to kind of find a combination of both. And so what the combination is, in my eyes, is that, going back to the idea of positive and negative rights, you have the right to be provided with a system. You have the right to be provided with the availability for you to use the system. The system cannot be taken from you. You must be provided with a way to get healthcare. The system must be accessible, the system must be affordable, and the system must have high health outcomes. You are given the right to a system. You are not given a right to the care. You must work for the care. And in order for the care to be, up to the correct standard, it has to cost money. It has to, in order for it to work. And in order to not violate the rights of doctors. But if you were given the right to specifically a system, your right for the availability of, having the overall well-being of a society, it's there because you were given the system, which is affordable. But affordable does not necessarily mean free, because the system still has to work. And so if we were going to look at specifically the healthcare system in the United States, we're going to see that it fails to meet these moral criteria of affordability, accessibility, and health outcomes. And so the United States, despite spending significantly, insane, ridiculous amounts on healthcare, we rank relatively poorly in outcomes. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, more commonly known as the OECD, the U.S. has the 6th highest infant mortality rate, the 5th lowest life expectancy, and the 4th highest years of life lost due to premature mortality out of all OECD countries. Basically, if you don't know what the OECD is, basically the countries that mean something. Developed nations that can reasonably be expected to, function like a fucking normal place. So, even though we have such shitty outcomes, the U.S. is able to boast to the rest of the world that we have 10 of the top 20 global hospitals, we have 12 of the top biotech firms, and we have 14 of the best medical schools in the entire world. And so we have world-class hospitals, cutting-edge medical technology, and extremely qualified healthcare professionals, and yet we lag behind every other developed nation while spending more than twice the worldwide average on healthcare. Among developed countries, not even shitty nowheres. We spend more than twice the average of good countries on healthcare, and our healthcare outcomes are fucking horrible. So, this disparity raises questions about what are we doing? How are we going to change it? And so most people kind of agree that the U.S. owes its citizens better healthcare. Nobody's really satisfied. The U.S. is kind of shitting the bed, and nobody's happy about it. And yet, if you listen to the political debates, which are kind of, surrounding the issue, they don't address what to actually do. They'll say, oh yeah, the system sucks, and we're gonna do this to fix it, and we're gonna give it to minorities, and blah blah blah. They don't actually have any idea how to fix it. And so, they have no idea what the actual challenge is. And so I'm gonna kind of try to clarify the scope of the debate, of the U.S. healthcare system. Kind of like what I said earlier, I'm gonna look at it through access, affordability, and outcomes. And I'm going to provide you with a comparison of the rest of the world. And so, healthcare systems can be, classified in several ways, but the method that I found to be most fitting is the OECD triaxial perspective. And basically, this is kind of saying that a healthcare system can be either private, semi-private, or public. And a private healthcare system is financed directly through, personal private payments. Semi-private is obviously kind of a mix, and public healthcare is fully government funded. You don't pay, the government takes care of it for you. As you may know, the U.S. system specifically does not fit very neatly into any one of these categories. It kind of combines all of the three models. With, some extremely convoluted, poorly worked out, poorly coordinated funding system. So, if you're going to look at the CDC, Center for Disease Control, there are 14 different ways that the U.S. finances healthcare. And this is, private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, and a bunch of other weird, shitty programs. So, out of all these programs, basically 3 qualify as private healthcare, and that is private health insurance, workers' compensation insurance, and worksite healthcare. And these 3 sources are basically kind of gonna come out to a little over a third of the total U.S. healthcare spending. And the majority of private insurance plans are holy shit. The majority of private insurance plans are basically just given to you by your employer. And so if we're going to look at the semi-private healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid are basically 50% of all of U.S. healthcare expenditures, which is hundreds of billions of dollars. And Medicare serves 65 and older. You know that probably. And Medicare covers poor people. You also probably know that. And it makes up almost 50% of all spending. And so we've also got the very small public healthcare sector, which is the VA, or the Veterans Health Administration. But you also got you got military health, you've got Indian health, but basically the VA is kind of the main private public one. And so we've got the three elements. So keep in mind throughout what I'm going to say is that we have these three separate branches of healthcare within a single healthcare system. And so, no other country in the world combines all three different elements of healthcare. At least the ones that OECD classifies. And so, if we compare our healthcare system with the European healthcare systems, it'll provide, pretty good insight into what's going on with our healthcare. And so, if we look broadly across all of Europe, we're naturally the most, the reason we're doing Europe is it's where the highest healthcare is. It's one of the richest continents going to have the best healthcare. And so the European countries do not rely on primary private care like the US does. The two that do are the Netherlands and Switzerland, but it's much more semi-private. It's not fully private. I mean, it's private, but it's got some more public elements than just purely private. But every other country is some sort of universal or public healthcare. Like France, Belgium, Soviet bloc countries, they all are semi-private. Places like Spain, Italy, UK, Scandinavia, they're all public. So basically all of Europe is public or semi-public, and you've got the two exceptions of the private, but they're not like as private as the US is. And so designing a healthcare system which requires three completely different ethical objectives of how to distribute healthcare is harms the effectiveness, where we have to, policymakers have to make trade-offs between, what do we want to focus on, what do we want to be good. There's no way to fully appease three completely different elements of healthcare and have them all be strong. You're going to have to focus on them, and it's just going to be extremely complicated, and it's not going to work very well. Another one of the most significant issues in the U.S. is that it's like I was saying, is its reliance on outside private healthcare providers, particularly in a semi-private system. So we're going to have a semi-private system which basically entirely relies on the private healthcare. That's not going to work. So a lot of the private providers just completely decline to accept Medicare and Medicaid because they want to get more money from the people who don't need it. And so we're basically limiting our access to high quality care, and we're relying on these kind of shitty programs to just cover our ass, and it's not working. Where more and more Americans are becoming completely uninsured. Like a couple years ago, I think in 2022, there were like 26 million people who just had no health insurance at all. I mean, some of them might have had some, but it was basically so inadequate they might as well not have had it. And so the U.S. system is basically just completely fucking up. Nobody has health care. Well, not nobody. I mean, the vast majority do. But people don't have health care, or they have inadequate health care. Partially, this is because of affordability, where if you look at the data, the U.S. spends like almost $13,000 per person on healthcare. That is ridiculous. I mean, for example, Switzerland, who's got one of the best healthcare systems in the world, they spend $8,000, and they're market-driven. They're one of the more private ones. The Dutch system, which is also one of the more private ones, spends $6,000. So, out of the entire world, the two other primarily private systems spend $8,000 and $6,000 on healthcare, while the U.S. spends almost $13,000. What the fuck? And so, I mean, the healthcare problem cannot be fully attributed to simply, the private insurance, because it wouldn't make any sense given this problem. And so if we compare kind of the U.S. system internally, we're going to see that the per capita spending on the healthcare is actually pretty different across the groups. Like Medicaid, for example, is like $10,500 per person. while some people with private may only pay 8, but and like veterans may only pay 6. And so if we looking back at that number of the U.S. spending almost $13,000 per person, well, a lot of it is coming from systems like Medicaid, whereas you look at the more private, the private's down kind of in the 8,000 range. So basically, the system is entirely fucked. I know I keep saying this, but it's disjointed and it's fragmented and it doesn't work, and it's not affordable. And so, how do we move in a way which makes the U.S. system overall less strange, less of a patchwork of multiple different ways of financing healthcare? How do we unify it? Well, we unify it by making a single system. At least this is my idea. The way that we address the fragmented nature of the U.S. healthcare system is to make it one model. It's what the rest of the world does. Why not us? We spend a ridiculous amount of money trying to finance 3 separate systems which don't overlap. If we had one system, we would cut down on an extraordinary amount of costs. People would know what was going on. Life would basically just be way more easy. And now, the blame can't entirely be put on the government. The system is criticized for complexity, waste, and inefficiency, but particularly by administrative costs. But the public does actually share some blame. The average person is going to demand pretty extensive services from an already overburdened system. The system is struggling, and we aren't helping. If you look at what's going on in America, we've got obesity, we've got suicide, we've got murder rates, we've got poor lifestyle choices. And so if we're going to fix this system, we're going to have a recognition of the ethical debate, which I talked about earlier, where we're going to have to recognize that there is a balance between healthcare as a commodity and a right, a balance which makes sense and a balance which actually exists, where it's not as fragmented as it seems. And we're also going to have to essentially unify the system, make it a singular system, and make some better life choices. That's really all that we can do at this point. So, thank you for listening to my extraordinary conversation.